Again, I'm going to pose a question, and Professor Alivez and Shane are going to respond. But I also want to stress that this is a conversation. So at any point, whenever anyone wants to respond, just raise your hand and jump in. In other words, this is not, the lecture part is over. I did that. So now this is a conversation. I'm sorry, I didn't mean the lecture so long, but I just felt like I had to say that stuff. So here's the first question for our distinguished, these distinguished scholars. Can you describe when and where you discovered Baldwin, his life and his work, and what attracted you to him or it? So, anyone?
So I'll get started. Thank you so much. I want to start by just thanking you all for the invitation, and it's nice to be here. And it's really amazing to see how crowded this room is. It's really inspiring. I don't know if I can say when I discovered Baldwin. I think I always heard of him before I even ever read him. I'd heard that James Baldwin was this kind of writer and political figure. So, and maybe, I don't know where, maybe it was church, maybe it was my family, but I knew he existed. And I didn't actually read his work until I was in graduate school. Because my undergrad institution I was an English major, and it was very British lit heavy, so I didn't read very much American literature at all. I actually had to go to grad school to learn African American literature. And I began studying Baldwin mostly on my own because I wanted to figure out who is this really big, important writer whose work I didn't know. And what attracted, actually, I think weirdly, what attracted me, what made me want to read more of him was that I knew he was important, but I really didn't know why. Does that make sense? That I heard about him, I knew he held kind of a big presence in my imagination, in cultural imagination, in scholarly imagination, but I hadn't really read his work. So I felt both kind of guilty, like I was a bad scholar, but also trying to figure out what was it about his work that spoke to so many people? Why did so many people know of Baldwin, had read some of his work, and I was just trying to figure that out.
That was fascinating, thank you. Shane?
That kind of hits for me. Like, I was the same way. I found Baldwin only maybe 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, because I was invited to kind of do this, and I love to research stuff, and I, in a similar way, like, heard about Baldwin basically my entire life. My dad talked a lot about other, figures like Martin Luther King, Obama recently, but really, he mentioned Baldwin because he also loved reading when he was younger, but never really talked about him much. You know what I mean? I never really understood his impact until I got this opportunity, and I really got into it. But I kind of felt some, not like shame, but just like, embarrassment. It's like,
I think that was mine too.
It was like silly. But then I got into it, and why it stuck for me, I don't know. I think I understood. I think I started to understand why it was so resonant with a lot of people. Because the first thing that I read was Giovanni's Room. That book, like, especially in this conversation about, queer identities and things like that, that book opened up with the whole door, a lot of things that I didn't even know were real emotions that people could even write down or talk about. I think that was the impact, at least for somebody like me, like a young person, seeing that for the first time in writing so clearly was probably why James Baldwin kind of had a staying impact on my life. And then I dug deeper into Beale Street.
Can I add something to that too? So I think,
Yeah, absolutely.
I know, well, what you said resonated with me because I think part of the first thing I really read when I started to,
Perfect.
the first thing I read was his first novel, Plateau on the Mountain.
Yeah.
And that book, because I had grown up in the church, it just resonated so much with me. So it really was about when I felt obligated to actually kind of read this stuff. I found a text that actually I felt that resonated with my own experience. So I felt connected to that book, but that made me want to keep reading Baldwin because of what happened when I read that first book. So similar to what you're saying.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. I already talked at the last symposium in the spring. I talked about my introduction to Baldwin, so I'll spare you that. So let's keep rolling here. Is there a single work that best captures the impact that Baldwin has had on your own life or work, or even how you see yourself in America?
Is it a single work or a single word?
A single word. I can't read my own handwriting.
I give the right answer.
I can't read my own writing, I'm sorry. is a single, not word, W-R-D, not W-R-K, that best captures the impact, the impact that Baldwin has had on your own life and or work, and even how you see yourself in America. You wanna start, Shane?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess penetrating is probably the first thing that I think of. It was the first thing that came to mind because, again, like when I mentioned things like Giovanni's Room, a really interesting book about kind of denying yourself, and because of things that have been in place long before you even knew that you were denying yourself. It penetrated my defenses. I didn't know that some kind of work could hit me like that on a level that nothing else ever had. And I mean, I feel like that's also the same for his impact in the culture in general. It gets to the root of what he says, gets to the root of a lot of things and kind of pierces through any kind of smoke or illusions, which I feel like is, one of the key things that makes him so distinguished in history. But that's how I feel.
Oh, that's really helpful. I think the word, this is really tough to think of a single word for me.
Yeah.
But I think the word that came to mind for me was actually station, and by that I mean social station. So, and I'll break that down a little bit. In his book, No Name in the Street, he talks about part of what racism did was force African Americans to know their place, right? Know where you can and can't be in the social world. And that actually had like you're saying, penetrating, he articulates ideas so clearly and concisely that it's really, really helpful. But that really shaped a lot of my work that has to do with space, because part of what I think about a lot is how things like racism, homophobia, inform our experience of space. They impact how we move through the world, they impact how we understand the spaces we inhabit, and make us feel limited to know our place, as it were. So that, I've obviously had a profound impact upon how I'm thinking in terms of how I understand the world, but also in terms of the things I write about in my own work, how I think about how populations are often limited in terms of the social world, or don't feel like they have full access to the social world. And that becomes kind of a problem of citizenship.
Just kind of on that topic, actually, there's kind of an intersection with something that I'm studying, maybe kind of off to the side, but there's a lot of what you said about racism, like kind of demonstrating where your place is. And I think about this a lot because there's an idea or an understanding now in sacred design how literal physical lines have been made to separate people. It's something that I thought about and discovered like while getting into my major, kind of how it gets into every part of the culture, it's not just a social thing, it's not just like a spiritual thing, it is very real and manifested in the world.
If I can, I just say one thing. Play on the fact that, because you're a civil engineer.
Yeah.
And it's important, I'm going to, a little bit of a pun, but it's true that racism is engineered. Like, it is engineered, and it engineers society control. It shapes how cities are put together, where they build highways. Like, that actually informs all that. So there is a really important connection between kind of what you're studying and these ideas that Baldwin was thinking about.
But I guess but I guess just on the topic of kind of being engineered, it kind of has to be. It's not something that's intrinsic. I don't believe that, at least. A lot of people will say in the nurture versus nature argument some other things, but I don't think that's intrinsic. So just to add to that and be done with it, I think you do have to engineer it. It has to be manufactured.
We just started I'm teaching at Baldwin seminar this semester, so we just started our discussion of Go Tuttle on the Mountain today, and one of the things we talk about is Baldwin in these different spaces. And so in public space and private space, so we talked about the home, and then there's an early scene in the novel where he goes to Central Park, and he is sort of freed and liberated there, but then he goes to Broadway and he goes to Fifth Avenue, in other words, white New York City, and he doesn't go into any of the stores or the spaces because he knows that even though this is the North, that the lines separating where black bodies and white bodies are permitted to be is very stark, and those lines are impenetrable, they're not porous. So this idea about Baldwin, and then we also know Baldwin's own sort of geographic trajectory, right? That he didn't feel at home here, so he fled the country in 1948. He said with $48 and $24 and no French, and went to Paris. So this idea of space and geography and these various spaces are very important for Baldwin. So I'm gonna stop. I mean, I've got like more questions, but I want to see if there's anyone who'd like to comment on anything that has been said, or maybe even respond to the questions that I asked our two conversants, respond to those questions themselves. So I could, right? So I see a hand up. Do you want to stand up and maybe Leah can share the microphone? A microphone? Thank you, Leah.
You might have to come up. Would you mind? Sorry. We're recording it as well, so that way you're.
One thing I noticed is that you said something about like the Black Panther Party and like how like one of its members like
Hold the mic up.
one of its like members like you know tried to disvalidate James Baldwin by you know pointing at his queerness. Is this a problem in the Black Panther Party? Like, are they like is there like overall like a lot of homophobia in the Black Panther Party? Because like I like one of the members, the former members, Angela Davis, is now a lesbian, and I'm trying to see like if that's why she left.
Thank you, Delula, for that question. And actually, Professor Alivez has written a book on Black nationalism. So we got an expert here.
I'm happy to start answering. It's a really great question, a really important question historically. And that the way I would begin to answer your question is like, was the Black Panther Party like homophobic? They were as homophobic as all the rest of American society is.
Yes.
There is not an organization or group in this country that isn't impacted by or participating in homophobia. So I just also don't want to make them seem exceptional.
That's right.
They're just like the rest of the United States. But it is important to recognize there were kind of strong tenets of homophobia and sexism in the Black Panther Party, but it wasn't inclusive of everyone. For instance, Huey Newton writes this letter, and he says in his letter he writes that, who's another Black Panther, he says that he felt like actually homosexuals were the most oppressed people in the country. And in terms of thinking about the ability or the possibility of connecting with or solidarity with kind of queer population. So I say that to say, for every Cleaver, there's also a Huey Newton. Like there are different ways of thinking that happen. And someone like Angela Davis is there and leaves, for a lot of reasons, the sexism is part of it. So there's just, like any organization, it was messy.
Yes.
It was messy. And I say that because I don't want to devalue it, but I also don't want to deny those realities because they impact people's actual lived experience when they experience homophobia, they experience sexism. And I think we have to always study any social formation in its fullness and understand what limitations were there and what things were made possible by them. That's how I begin to answer your question.
Thank you, Delila, for that question. And I would just say, Google Professor Alivez mentioned Huey Newton's letter. Google it. It's a fascinating document in that he completely, as Professor Alivez said, mixed the situation between what black folks are facing and what gay people are facing. He makes that connection, whereas very few people, were doing it at the time. And so, yes, we definitely can't sort of say, and I also appreciate Professor Avila's point that the Panthers were no more homophobic than any other organization, including so-called liberal organizations were very homophobic. Other comments or questions that anybody would like to? Oh, yeah, please.
Thanks so much. I have a question about how Baldwin was able to kind of collapse and reconfigure masculinity and femininity and sexuality through your own readings of his work. What did it mean to be a man if you were Baldwin, and what were those characteristics in some ways that were, I think Keith, you and I talked about how he, at the end of his life, wanted men around him to be caregivers and wanted the sort of the country of women to be, in a way, lived in by men as well, and so that there weren't these very clear roles between men and women, and men could explore their own humanity. I wonder if you all would mind talking about that.
Thank you. So, Shane, you want to comment?
Yeah, there's this phrase like a lot of boys, a lot of men hear all the time, be a man. And it's something that I think about, and I don't think in any of the stories that I've read so far, except for Beale Street, it's explicitly said like that. But I'm saying that to say, there's kind of a constant risk with masculinity that you're taking, especially in the stories that you can kind of see. There's always some kind of threat that you're working with or against, especially, and that's compounded by the fact that you're, in a lot of the times, you know, in James Baldwin's story specifically, a black person. So if you're trying to look at it from the perspective, like in Beale Street, from the perspective of Tish, or if you're looking from the perspective of Fani, you're trying to be a masculine person in this world, and the way he deconstructs it specifically in Beale Street is he looks at these characters from the lens of a woman. And you look at his dad, you look at Fani's dad, you look at her dad, you look at Tish's dad, and they kind of touch on different parts of masculinity. And I talk about this because I want to get to the point to say that he breaks it down and shows you that the reality is being a man in America as a black person is incredibly hard, but the real lesson at the end is the authenticity to yourself. And I feel like this overarching line is present in a lot of his books. And I'm gonna pull this together by also bringing up Giovanni's Room, the part of authenticity. So the entire story is about him sort of denying the reality that he is a man-loving man. He falls in love with a man, lives with him, and abandons him. And sorry for the spoiler, but you know, he at the end is a white man free to the world with as much money and funds as he, you know, could need to get around in a completely different country outside of America and entirely alone. And because as a direct result of his inauthenticity, of his fear of himself, of his lack of self-acceptance and tenderness for himself, he lost everything, even his manhood. He lost the woman that could have made him a man, the one thing that he clung to make himself a man. And it removes the idea of reliance on other people, which a traditional manhood is something, it's a value of traditional manhood, but it removes the reliance of other people and puts the responsibility on yourself to be honest with yourself. And contrasting Giovanni's Room, the result of that with Beale Street, Fani was honest with himself throughout the entire thing. He's an artist, he's an empathetic man. He has a friend that he lets come over and cry and vent to. It's essentially therapy for his friend. He cooks and, you know, helps his, you know, he helps his girlfriend. He intends to be a present father, and even when he's wrongly worked against and put in jail, you know, at the end of it, the story concludes kind of bittersweet, but at the end of it, you can kind of see where Fani has his head up high still. Even though he's behind bars, I feel like spiritually he's more liberated than the main character of Giovanni's Room ever was, even though he had the entire world as you know, at his fingertips. And I feel like that's what he does. He breaks it down like that.
I don't want to follow that. That's a great statement. No, I would say, my thinking on this is, when you read Baldwin's work, you realize that part of what he's always trying to help us understand is that gender is a trap. It's a trap, and it's a problem. And I think he is as important a social commentator on gender as he is about race. He's not often talked about that way, but he is. He helps us think about gender. And he doesn't just want to kind of undermine our traditional investments in a particular kind of masculinity or femininity. He wants us to understand that we all have the potential for both, which might not feel super radical in the 21st century, but it's still a radical way of thinking about gender when so many of us are invested in a particular kind of masculinity and femininity and see them as always kind of opposed to each other. So I think that's not truly an answer to your question, but I think pointing out how he wants us to always unpack our investment in gender is what he's trying to do through a lot. And I would say this is what kind of connects his essays with his novels, is precisely that point. and it comes rooted in what you were talking about in the Freaks essay. And for me, the Freaks essay, which is my favorite Baldwin essay, later it's later published as Here Be Dragons.
Right.
And to me, that essay is the synopsis of what he'd been doing in all his novels.
Yes.
Like, he kind of gets his point in the early 80s, late 70s, and writes that essay. It's kind of like, this is what I've been saying for the past 20 or 30 years, and he puts it in essay form.
Right. And he published that just 2 years before his death, which belies the idea of people that said Baldwin was washed up and could no longer write. I shared this in the spring exhibit, but I think it's worth repeating. So in the late 70s, I think in 1979, there was a new news program on television called 2020, and it was supposed to be the counterpart to CBS's 60 Minutes. So for their first episode, they had actually had gotten an interview with James Baldwin, and about 79, Baldwin was a literary lion. He was, very well celebrated, very well known, established as a major American writer. And so a person went out and interviewed Baldwin and interviewed him in Harlem and interviewed him with his family. So when the show was supposed to air, they didn't show it, and it was not included in the episode. And so about 5 years ago, somebody actually found this 10-minute clip, 15-minute clip, and they found the notes, and basically the person in charge of the program said that, well, Baldwin in 1979 was a washed-up gay has-been, and nobody wants to hear about him. And so this really fascinating 10-15-minute portrait of Baldwin has been lost. Unfortunately, now you can YouTube it, and you can find it on YouTube, it's all there. But at the time, Baldwin had basically been dismissed. I want to comment also on a couple of things that my esteemed panelists said. So Shane, you used the phrase, a country outside of America, to talk about Giovanni's room and David having to get out to a country outside of America to try to understand his sexuality and masculinity in a complex way. And then Professor Alivez, you said gender is a trap. So if anybody really wants to, so I'm glad you mentioned the essay, Here Be Dragons. If anybody wants to look at Baldwin's fictive, I would say, declaration of all of these ideas, you should read Another Country, right? One of my teachers at Chapel Hill, Professor J. Lee Green, used to call the novel Invisible Man his Bible. For me, Another Country is my Bible. Baldwin makes it very clear in Another Country that all of these things, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, all of these things are constructed and they're traps. And they're all designed for people to feel shame and isolated. And if people can be shamed and isolated, then you can be controlled. So what Baldwin tries to do in Another Country is present this sort of boundarylessness where people are not so caught up in gender and sexual orientation and straight and gay and male and female and black. All of these things which Baldwin insists are really things that are meant to compartmentalize and control you. So Another Country, I think, is Baldwin's most definitive and passionate and clear and long, it's about 500 pages, but statement about all of these things he's talking about. Were there any other questions, comments, observations? We'd love to hear from people in the audience. I see a hand up in the back.
Hello.
Hello.
This isn't my take. I just thought it was a pretty hot take and I wanted to bring it to you. There's a novelist named Glenn Greenwell who recently had an article with the New York Times where he says that Giovanni's Room is a homophobic book. And the reason he gave is because, one, everyone ends up dead or in despair. And the second reason he gives is because it presents relationships between two men as a logical fallacy, is what he says. And I just wanted to see your reaction. Yeah, I like your face already. I just wanted to get your, I guess to quote him more directly, he says, we need to understand that Giovanni's Room is a homophobic book, not only because everyone ends up dead and devastated, but because it treats durable love between men as logical absurdity, which is not true of Baldwin's other novels, he says. If we could understand how the book has nevertheless been life-saving for queer people, we can get past the facile conversations about affirming. I don't agree with that take. I just wanted to hear you talk about it.
The word facile is very fitting. That's facile.
I'll tell you a story.
Please.
No. I was smiling because I No, I think it's a really interesting reading, but I think to me that reading comes from, and I'm not at all trying to critique this writer, I respect their opinion, but I think they don't fully understand the book or its setting. So Giovanni's Room, and I've written about this, I see it as more than anything else, it's also a Cold War novel. Mm-hmm. And during the Cold War, homosexuality was seen as a threat, not just to individuals, but to the state. And part of what Baldwin is doing is kind of helping us understand what that meant in that novel. The fact that the novel is tragic is a reflection of how the state saw and treated actual homosexuals in the 1950s. So I'm not going to at all say that it's a bummer. It's not like an uplifting novel, but you have to understand part of what his project is situating it in this kind of global reality of the Cold War. And there's all this worry, especially in the United States at the time period, that homosexuals actually were a national threat, right? And that's really part of what he's responding to that rhetoric and thinking about it and helping us understand what it meant in the 1950s to actually have same-sex desire, like what that actually would look like. Mm-hmm. So that's one small response. But I think if you just read the novel and you're looking to be affirmed in your identity, you probably won't find that. But then something else you could do is ask yourself why every book has to affirm you. And is there something else you can pull from that text, another way of thinking that could still be helpful?
Well, I haven't read it. I've heard about it, and I'll be a bit more forceful in condemning that perspective. That's really facile and short-sighted, right? And so, for example, the premise is a lie. Everybody doesn't end up dead in Giovanni's Room. That's not true. That's not even true. So that's one problem. And then this idea about homophobia. Homophobia to whom? Right? So this is what I was trying to get at in the quote from the interview with Richard Goldstein, a white critic from the Village Voice, is that people impose these definitions about what's homophobic and how gay people are supposed to be as though there's a one-size-fits-all thing. And that really is, racist is too strong, but it's very condescending. Right? It's very condescending. So also I hate the fact that too often there's this idea of presentism, where in the present we impose a sort of conceptions of how things are now and impose them on things from the past. Well, in the 1950s, the prospects of being a gay person, homosexual was criminalized in a lot of places. So clearly it was going to not be what it would be now. So to ask a novel to be, quote, affirming is really, really short-sighted. And again, I should say I haven't read it. So I do want to say that I don't want to be like these people. When the movie The Color Purple came out, there were people condemning The Color Purple who admitted, "Oh, I haven't seen it." So I don't want to be one. I don't want to be one of those people. But just based on the little bit I've heard, and that's sort of the idea that it's homophobic, I really find problematic because there's this sort of part of the so-called queer community or queer intelligentsia or whatever that imposes these definitions on people like Baldwin and finds him wanting. And I really think that is, if not racist, it's paternalistic. It's paternalistic.
I
have more to say, but no, you go ahead.
I don't have too much to say because you guys are kind of saying it, but removed from context, yes, obviously it's going to seem a little bit different, but like the moral of the story isn't that, you know, if you're gay, your life is going to end up in tragedy. It's that denying yourself like how you feel and then constantly doing what a lot of people do when they're trying to present masculinity, which is pushing it down. Pushing it down will destroy you and everybody around you. That is one of the biggest themes you can take. Even if Giovanni was another woman instead of his wife or his fiance or whatever, and he was just having a regular affair, even if it was that and he was pushing it down because he had true feelings for this woman that wasn't his fiance, that would still be poignant, but it's even more important now because it's about being gay in the 50s, and that's a really big deal. It's anything but homophobic. I just had to say that because it's just ridiculous, and there's so much context that it is important to the story.
I would just say I agree with everything that's been said, but one small thing I would add is, you can think about the novel as being sad or a downer or whatever because of the ending, which I'm trying not to spoil in case you haven't read it. And it's shorter too, it's under a shorter novel, so a lot of novels are super long. This one's actually shorter.
Get that one.
But another way of thinking about that novel would be asking the question is, what happens when you're cut off from friendship and love? this is what happens. And the reality is, during the time period, if you were gay, you often were cut off. So it's kind of showing us what happens when we do what we're already doing, denying relationality, we're denying family, denying love to homosexuals. So the novel, and this is a bit of a trite metaphor, but the novel is really just a mirror. Mm-hmm. It's showing us what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't criticize it for not doing more, because we're not doing more, or we're doing more at that time period, right? It kind of presumes that there's more possible, but it's showing us the precise limitations of the time period and having us, reminding us of what happens when we cut off people from the community. Thank you.
And I'm glad you mentioned that mirror image. The opening image of the novel is actually the protagonist looking in a mirror. So the novel foregrounds that idea of looking and gazing.
Thank you for the beautiful question. I'm not sure I'll answer it effectively, but in my reading, but I like your point about thinking about and a focus on identity and perhaps moving away, thinking about this idea of authentic self. But what I guess I want to say is, I think Baldwin, in his works, we see the understanding of identity that's always relational, and I think he is asking us to understand sometimes to the detriment, sometimes to the benefit. But I'm not sure in his writings identity ever exists outside of relation, meaning that authentic self must be understood in relation to something else. Even as you were talking, thinking yourself as an uncle or a brother or a nephew, that I think that's precisely what he's trying to get us to think to. I think one of the problems he's trying to get to in his writing is moving away from notions of identity that refuse relationality, that refuse to understand the connection between and among people. And perhaps when we stop doing that work, stop excising from the community, denying the fact that blacks and whites are part of the same community, only then can we get to that authentic self. So I think, again, I'm not sure I'm hitting your question directly, but I can only think about how to answer that question through his focus, I think, across his work on relational ideas of identity.
So, some of what you're saying, though, I mean, it might help us chip away that incredible question. That was great. But for me, what that also kind of helps me understand or think about is, instead of just looking at things in relationship or with the boundary of relationships, I think what Baldwin ultimately is trying to do is take down any kind of barrier between those kinds of thoughts in your head, between you and me. And I think in a panel a few months ago, actually, at the last symposium, we were watching some of his films, and he was talking to a crowd of people, and he's talking to them, and we're talking. He's got a whole crowd in front of him, and he says, I'm losing it now. He's talking about how there are all of these people, and you have to feel some kind of sadness, some kind of empathy for white Americans, because, and it's relevant because he says, I kind of understand you, I can feel you. And part of what I felt like he was saying is, what your perspective is, it flows through me, but how I see the world can't get through you. And I feel like that's pertinent to what we're talking about now, because there are separations in how you talk about your relationships and your identity. But I ultimately feel like what Baldwin is trying to say is that there isn't. It is one person. And I don't know, to answer your question, if it's autonomous or, if it's its own thing, or if it's, natural. But I can say I do think they all work together, and separate, they're not their own things. You know what I mean? They kind of have to be a whole to be something, all parts of you.
And I'll just offer a short comment on this. I think this is one of the reasons why Baldwin loved Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was as much of a philosopher and a moralist than he was anything else. And so he tried to get us to change the vocabulary of how we talked about racism, to think of it not as an issue about these constructed and manufactured identities, but how is racism and race hatred a moral issue and a moral failing? And James Baldwin's work then often engages questions of sexuality, race, and identity, and in engaging them in that way, he ultimately poses them in a moral way. So it's not just about those things, but it's also about the larger issue. And Baldwin's sort of grounding principle, which was King's grounding principle, was love, right? So if you can truly love, then you remove the mask, you remove the barriers that disappear. but most people can't get to that point because that is the liberating space. But most people don't get to that liberating space. So to your point, Aubrey, that the identities are just sort of part of this sort of moral fabric that we have to cut through. But it's almost impossible to cut through. And I don't know if Baldwin even himself did it. I mean, he's a world traveler, and he never really felt at home because I think he always grappled with these multiple impositions of these identities and masks. So, other questions or comments? Other questions or comments? I see a hand over here. Yes.
So like, I've been looking at all these pictures throughout the exhibition, like how it like tells like the story of the '60s in relation to James Baldwin. There's plenty throughout, and also but I'm more curious about these ones.
Yeah.
And like, is that part of it too? And also like, what were you trying to say with like how James Baldwin like uniquely contributed to like the Black political movement, like and added to it, like how like what was it? What was about what he did that? I know like he really like expanded like really like expanded like homosexuality, like gayness, and in race and like sexuality, but like what?
You good?
So, how would you say James Baldwin relates like Black political movements, and like what part did he play?
Okay. Thank you for your question. So actually, we're going to start with the first part of your question, and we're so fortunate to have the curator of this wonderful exhibit here. So I'm going to let Don actually address the young man's question. What were you trying to say with this exhibit in its relation to Baldwin?
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
This was just such an interesting artifact that, this from this 1964 period, and then it was a unique collaboration. So my interest in this is more or less artistic, in the sense that a black man, a black intellectual writer would collaborate with a Jewish American photographer at a time. Partially this show is about blacks and Jews working together in the 60s, which was something that we don't really remember as much today. And Lenitra Berger wrote an essay back on this wall here that you can read, sort of contextualize that, and she's teaching a class on that. So I just thought it was very interesting, like Baldwin and Avedon had gone to high school together, DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. And they were friends in high school. And this was the largest high school in the United States, actually, at the time. And they worked on a literary journal together. So I just found it fascinating that these two kind of idiosyncratic people found each other and maintained a relationship over time, and created this work at this crucial moment in time. And I think it kind of gets lost, maybe, because it's a collaboration, but the essay really touches on all the points here that you guys have been talking about. And but it's also, Avedon was an extremely successful photographer. Like, he didn't get on the cover of Time the way James Baldwin did, but he did get on Newsweek much later.
Google that too.
But I think the point, what was his contribution? That's more for you to answer, but for me, one of the things I noticed was a discussion about psychiatry at the time. I think that's an important thing in terms of self, the authentic self and things like that. The attitudes about psychiatry were very different back then, and Baldwin in the essay is kind of critical of psychiatry in general. As we move through the 60s, we've got the effects of Abraham Maslow and the American Human Potential movements and other kinds of elements coming into play that ultimately led to kind of new age culture, if you will. Like this last, they both believe that that racism was a mental illness, that it caused mental illness in blacks and whites. And that's why 20% of the book takes place, or photographs from mental institution, which most people at the time thought was extremely heavy-handed, and just put them off the book entirely. And I'm kind of wandering around your question.
No, that's great.
Does that help a little bit? Like, we've also wanted to, this book in and of itself was not really enough information. So we actually did biographical searches for people that we could find in the book so that you could understand why they were put in. It's a very intentionally designed book. And then just everything that happened around the book as well.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad you mentioned the mental illness piece of it. And I know Professor Alivez has worked, his scholarship deals with issues about mental health and race and sexuality as well. And this was an important issue for Baldwin, whose father had mental health issues and who actually died in a mental health facility, who really racism and race hatred became a cancer that really destroyed him. One of Baldwin's closest friends and mentors was an artist, visual artist and painter named Buford Delaney that Baldwin met when Baldwin was only 16. And Buford Delaney became a famous African-American painter, but also later in his life had mental health issues. Baldwin himself had challenges with mental health. He had a couple of suicide attempts. So this is a part of Baldwin's work that people don't really talk about as much as they do the sexier things like race and sexuality, but this issue is focused on mental health and racism as a mental health problem, right? We were reading Blues for Mr. Charlie last week, and Blues for Mr. Charlie is set in what Baldwin calls Plague Town, USA, right? And so the plague is race, the sickness, the disease, the pathology is race and race hatred, and how that has a mental health dimension too. Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else? I see a hand here. So happy my students are asking questions.
A student of Professor Clark, not looking for any extra credit, but I had discovered Baldwin in what I felt like to be an unglamorous and unsexy way. I feel like there's so many micropatriot people my age tend to find it, which is through sort of these photos of the covers of said books, and then you get like little saucers of tea and cigarettes and rings with fingers aloof on the side. And then you dive in, and then you see more of who this author is, and then I was able to consume a lot more of his work. But my question was, so then what I'm saying is that I found it out at first. The first veil of what all it was aesthetic, right? So it wasn't that I had known who this author was, as I knew the allure of who this author was and what was represented in the covers of said books. And my question is as three people who sort of reveled with the feelings of incredibly complex, articulated words put down onto paper in prose and poetry, what would you say in an age like this, because of how the way that I consumed it, what would you say in an age like this, what is lost when consuming Baldwin now, and what is gained that wasn't as you were in the 60s?
Fascinating. Thank you, Ethan.
You're welcome.
I guess I can. That's a really fascinating question that really makes us think about our contemporary moment and how we consume art. And I think what I think is interesting about consuming now, so I'll do the gain first, because Baldwin did a lot of interviews, like television interviews, and they're actually really easy to Google. So I think what's really great about our 21st century is we have really more access to Baldwin and Baldwin's words than we did like 30 years ago when you couldn't necessarily find those interviews. So I think so Google him and Google any interview he's done. There's a great one he does with Nikki Giovanni. They're all great. Audre Lorde. Watch those interviews. They're amazing. He's such a good interviewee, and he usually interviews his interviewer back. He's great. What's lost? Actually, I'm gonna say I'm not sure anything is lost. I think the way we get to art isn't always like the same path. It might be something about a book cover that strikes us, something we heard about something that strikes us. I'm not sure that actually changes. The ways that we have access to art changes, but it's sometimes this serendipity how we discover something. So I'm a little reluctant to say that something's lost. We're just in a different time, and we might read our books digitally versus actually having a hard book. So maybe that's not a cop-out of an answer. I'm just not sure. I don't want us to understand ourselves only as a deficit, because this is the world that we have. I'd rather think about what, like I said, like we have more access to them than we ever have before. So maybe that's a good thing about the 21st century. Maybe.
I'm gonna say this from the perspective of somebody who's like you in the information age. I might have a little bit more of a pulse of, or an understanding of the pulse of what happens with people with as much information as we have being born.
He's calling me old.
Yeah. I was trying to dance around that.
You're old, I hate to hear what he's calling me.
But I wanna say this. I think it's not lost, but I think it's attention that we don't have. But I also think that's something that's gonna develop. Here's how I mean that. We have, like GerShun said, all of the information at our fingertips. Recently lost pieces of media and interviews now available to us. But the thing is, because there's everything there's so many things pulling us in different directions. It has to be a concerted effort to get into these kinds of things now, because there's such a sea of information. And I feel like what's lost isn't any of the work. None of the work is lost, but it is the attention. There's so many other figures out there. You just said it yourself, the one thing that got you into it was the aesthetic. There are other people who might have as much to say as Baldwin that don't have the aesthetic, that don't have some of the, the beautiful prose, that aren't as interesting looking or outspoken as he was, but said similar things. But he was the one that caught your attention. And I don't think there's anything lost, but I do think that is, as you were kind of saying, the difference in our, in the time. But what's added is definitely all of the information that we have too. It's kind of double-edged.
Thank you for both of those responses. Anyone else? Anyone else? I see a hand here. Yes, please. Okay, and then Leah's just informed me that this was going to be the last question, so this is going to be it. Yes.
I remember, I believe in the beginning, you had said that Baldwin grew up like in a traditional Christian household. I was interested in what way did he end up viewing religion? I know you said he rejected traditional views, but did he completely reject it? Did he reconstruct it to a different definition? Just how did he view religion, given his upbringing, given the things he encountered?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, given that religion is so profoundly important for James Baldwin. So I'm going to let me. So in the far next time, Baldwin lays out his sort of position on Christianity in America. And he says that both whites and blacks have taken Christianity and exploited it and used it for whatever their objectives are, and that they bastardized and perverted it. So for Baldwin, what religion is supposed to be is rooted, the grounding principle of religion is supposed to be love. Love of self, love of others, empathy, all of those things that people pay lip service to. But Baldwin felt that, he said one of Baldwin's most famous quotes was that the most segregated time in America was 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Because, and it's sadly it still is to some degree, because religion has become a tool that people have used to dominate, to silence, to shame, to otherize, right? And so Baldwin felt like the church as an institution, right, never lived up to what religion was meant to be. In other words, that these institutions use it as a way to control and to dominate and usurp power. But Baldwin felt that the true religion of love was something that everybody missed. And so David Leeming is Baldwin's biographer, and in his biography he quoted Baldwin as saying this, and I think this is a profound quote. Baldwin says, "I had to leave the church and I had to leave the pulpit in order to preach the gospel." So Baldwin never stopped preaching.
He learned this from his father, he learned it from that church, and even though he disavowed the sort of institution of Christianity and religion, he never rejected this primary, fundamental, foundational principle, which was love. And that was what he preached.
I have nothing to add to that, except to say that he leaves the church never leaves him. You see the influence of his growing up in the church in all of his books. Like, it is always there. And he's always, there's investment in love, but also you know that he's read the Bible. He's very interested in Christianity. So it just shows the church is always there. It's always there, but he had to leave.
Right.
I have nothing else to add.
And the irony is that what he grew up with in the church is a space that was not hospitable, that was not loving, that was about, damnation and hell and sin and shame. But Baldwin understood the messages of the Bible, and he understood the ritual of the church, and he understood the music of the church. All of the sort of these African American expressive and vernacular things that were in the church, he absorbed those things. So anything you read by him is going to have the cadences of a sermon. It's going to have the cadences of blues and gospel and all of those things. So when he disavowed the church, he wasn't disavowing the sort of core, the good part about it. He was disavowing the idea that the church uses itself as a tool to demean and to diminish others. That's what he was disavowing, not its sort of other positive dimensions.
Can I make a comment on that question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so also in the fire next time, Baldwin talks about meeting Elijah Muhammad, who's like Malcolm X's, well, he was like in charge of Nation of Islam and Malcolm X was really kind of his stuff, right? And he goes to this like dinner with Elijah Muhammad in Chicago, and that's like the setup of a large portion of the book. And part of what he's interested like with the religious question is kind of like, as they were saying, like this piece of love that's getting missed. And so a lot of what's motivating people in the Nation of Islam is like this rejection of this religion that has been used by Europeans to oppress them. And like identifying with this religion that was more popular in Africa and Asia and, kind of shifting your alliances a bit. But for Baldwin, what he finds dissatisfying in that conversation is like he doesn't feel like it's getting to the root of the problem. It's just kind of shifting around. And he feels like, I can't remember the quote, I forgot. which one I was thinking about specifically. But there's a quote that I noticed from that book where he talks about, that some people cling to their faith so strongly because they don't have anything left. If they let go.
Right.
And I think that is a lot of what he was trying to explore in that tension of religion. He also spends a lot of the beginning of the book talking about his time preaching and his time in the Church of Harlem growing up. And then he's kind of contrasting it against this particular conversation that he has, I think, in 1963 in Chicago. And so it's really fascinating. If you're interested in that, I would definitely recommend checking out that book. It's great. It's not too long.
Great. Thank you for that advertisement for the Fire Next Time. And we're going to actually have to end, but I just want to again thank our panelists, Dr. GerShun Alivez and Mr. Shane Stevenson. Thank to both of them for a wonderful.
Thank you both so much, and thank you, Dr. Clark. That was incredible. What a great way to start the symposiums. I actually have Aubrey Williams, your friend, who's going to read a quote from the wall.
Okay.
Come on, Aubrey. And that's how we're going to end now.
Imagine I'm James Earl Jones. And I want to thank the curator because as we were talking and discussing, I read that. And I posed a question about the authentic self. And Professor Clark took that and invoked Martin Luther King as a moral person. And the central message of Martin Luther King was love. And then we talked about Baldwin leaving the church, but the church never left him. And I think the authentic self is the loving self. What people in religion say, God is love, and the God in you and me, that's what life is about, to see the God and the love in you, and you see it in me. And I saw this quote, it says, the sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. That's America today. Trump and the election in 7 weeks. That's what's before us.
And that is the end of this session, and another panel is going to start moving forward, so we hope you'll stay.
No reason.